Just by way of introduction, my name is Stanley. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of New South Wales. I'm with the Australian Centre for Cybersecurity, located at AFA. My supervisor is here and some of my colleagues, but I'm not going to introduce her directly or them, because I'm sure they'll be too embarrassed at the end of this to be associated. But thanks so much for coming. So let's build a wall. Let's build a great wall. A beautiful wall, as Donald Trump would put it. Okay. Now, this is a bit of a different kind of wall, and this is a wall between the general duty of a telecommunications companies, that you guys are commonly known as ISPs, to give what we lawyers would call assistance that is reasonably necessary to law enforcement and national security agencies. And how they do that is by disclosing, either voluntarily or under what we call an authorization and notification process, and without a judicial warrant, information that is related to the content or the substance of a communication, aka metadata. That's the first thing that we want to separate. We also want to separate that from the duty that's placed on the ISPs to retain for at least 2 years this information, and also between the choice that is given to the ISPs to retain transient metadata for any period. Okay? So we get what they're required to retain, and then there's the transient information that is not required to be retained for 2 years, but that they would keep for their general business purposes. And you guys will know a lot more about that, because I'm sure a lot of you are more from the technical field. And they use this for billing purposes, and they use this for network security, for example. And we also want to look at the legal duty that's placed on these telcos, that is to do their best to protect the telecommunications infrastructure and exercise what the new bill that's being proposed now calls competent supervision over the network. That is what's been proposed, and comments are due in terms of the TSSR by 3rd of February. And they must do that over the information and the communication that's been transported over the network. We also want to separate that from the general duty that's placed on these telecommunications companies to disclose, and in commas, any information, also under the TSSR regime, and on demand to the Attorney General's Department, or that power is also delegated to the ASIO, and that same information is then shared with the Australian Federal Police. But it's done with less oversight than it would be done under the metadata retention regime. So this proposed legal duty of the telcos is also expanded to a new one, and that's the one under what has been proposed for civil cases. So we want to differentiate between that, the TSSR, and the metadata retention regime as well. What is being proposed is to disclose metadata in civil cases by whatever process that's still to be designed, and this is the metadata that's required to be retained. And that metadata we need to differentiate from metadata that's being retained voluntarily for the business purposes of the ISP. Now let's also separate that from the information that's related to the contents and substance of those communications and the content. What is the difference between the metadata and the content? And a key issue there is whether URLs is metadata and how that's been treated under the regime, and we'll talk about that in a little while. Now, we also need to distinguish between the various types of metadata, because not all metadata is created equally. And then there's the issue of oversight, which is ex post facto or ex ante, and has to be independent judicial oversight or the administrative oversight that's being exercised by, for example, the Office of the Attorney General, or the executive oversight that's being exercised, and then the parliamentary oversight that's been exercised as well. And we also need to distinguish between the regulation of the local Australian telecommunications company versus the overseas telecommunications company, who are the over-the-top content and service providers, because they are also being regulated differently. The last issue that we need to distinguish and build a wall around are the policy interpretations that are being made by the government that contradict the legal wording, for example. And towards the end, I will talk about this unprecedented wall that we will build addressing all of these issues. This evening, I would just like to talk about the following types of metadata specifically, because the pool of metadata includes location information, for example, includes location identifiers and device identifiers. But I wouldn't want to talk about those today. I'm talking about the 5-tuple, which is the source and destination IP addresses and the port addresses, the source and destination port addresses, and then the protocol number. Whether that's being required to be retained, whether that's voluntarily retained. And those are the types of information that cuts across the 7 layers of the OSI model. And then I want to include under that umbrella also the source and destination MAC addresses. Okay. So there's a lot to digest and a lot to cover. But I would want to give this a holistic picture so we can see how all of this fits in together. Because some of the structural challenges that we have with the regime are because all of these issues are addressed in silos and we are not considerate of these other various factors. So generally the metadata creation and retention and disclosure policy and regulatory framework can be divided into 5 color zones. These are red, amber, blue, green, and the gray zone. But mind you, the whole regime is a bit of a gray zone, isn't it? A bit of a gray area. And that's why we're having this talk. In the red zone, that's the content. And that refers to content that's being intercepted via lawful interception. Some of the metadata that's being sourced is being used for lawful interception, for example. All the other zones are about the metadata. Metadata does include location information, as I say, but we won't address that specifically. In the amber zone, I want to refer to the 3-tuple, as opposed to the 5-tuple. Those are the URLs, the web browsing history, the metadata relating to SIP, the file transfer protocol, or IMAP, for example. The destination information related to those protocols, because those are exempted under this provision from being required to be retained. So, critical distinction here between what's required to be retained versus what may be voluntarily retained. The amber zone talks about information that is not required to be retained. So this is not retained data. Good, not retained data. I will get back to that again a little while. Now, there are a few critical issues with regards to metadata within the amber zone. Okay? This is information, this is metadata that's generated if you access the internet. If you use the internet access service, then that metadata would not be required to be retained. But a few critical issues arise from the amber zone. And that is whether this type of metadata would be or is already not accessible under the civil court process. Why? Because this is not retained data. What the latest proposal aims to do under the TSSR, or under the civil court process, is to extend civil cases to retain data only, and not data that is voluntarily retained. Not data that is obligatory to retain for the purposes of the regime. So this new proposal for civil cases is not about metadata that is optional to retain, and that distinction, as I said earlier, is quite crucial. The second issue is whether the Amber Zone metadata is content and should be treated similarly to content that is in the red zone. Because in terms of the government policy, what they say is that URL, for example, is in some cases telecommunications rather than content. But the law does not clearly identify that a URL is content and therefore would require a warrant. And I think we would agree that a judicial warrant would be preferred to access it. The telecommunications companies indicate that they do not disclose URLs except in emergency cases, but the law does not clearly identify it as such, so we know how that needs to be treated. The third issue under the TSSR is session metadata. That includes, as I indicated earlier, the source and destination information, the port number, for example. That session metadata under the TSSR would be quite crucial for a cybersecurity strategy, for a situational awareness strategy, but is not required to be retained, but may be retained voluntarily. If any of the ISPs opt to retain session data, they may retain it for any period between 6 to 12 months. So they need to run the forensic analysis to identify and detect threats and remedy threats, for example. But under the metadata regime, it is not required to be retained. The big question is whether under the TSSR, they would be required to retain it, and we will get to that in just a few minutes. In the blue zone, we refer to other policy and legal exceptions. Now, these exceptions state that certain types of metadata are also not required to be retained, similarly to the ones in the amber zone. The first policy exception that creates an issue here is the metadata that's created by over-the-top content and communication services, the overseas, specifically overseas OTT content providers. They are third parties that provide these services on top of the telecommunications network of the ISPs, and they are not regulated under the regime. The issue this creates for the TSSR, which is the telecommunication security, as telecommunication sector security reform, is that the telco is not required, and there are policy documents that indicate that the telco is not required to do deep packet inspection of third-party over-the-top services, because they're not required to retain the metadata from these services. And they're not required to disclose it to the agencies. But if they provide an over-the-top service such as VoIP, they would then be required to retain session metadata, the 5-tuple, and disclose that if it's requested by the agencies to do so. However, under the TSSR, the ISPs may opt to, because if they adopt that situational awareness strategy, they may opt to conduct deep packet inspection, or they may do it right now to the services that they provide, and they may do it for their voice over IP. Would they do it for over-the-top content? They opted not to, and that's why that exception was put in. But under the TSSR, would they be required to do so? I'll get back to that issue in a few minutes as well. Under the TSSR, if we look at cybersecurity, one of the biggest issues is over-the-top content. For example, web applications. They are a major target for cyber attacks. They're amongst the top 3. But the telco is practically made responsible under the TSSR, or would be made responsible under the TSSR, to prevent attacks that are caused, or that are attacks that emanate from over-the-top services and from over-the-top service providers that are not regulated. The telco would be required to prevent unauthorized attacks and incidents. And the big question is, if they are not allowed, or if they are excused from not conducting packet inspections over the top, how can they bear the responsibility to ensure that the network is protected and the information and the communications are not attacked? Secondly, the telco is informed by policy not to retain metadata if it does not have visibility of that information or does not have it available. However, the law requires the telco to create the metadata it is required to retain. The MAC addresses case is a case in point, for example. In respect of bring your own devices, the telco would not necessarily have sight of that. However, the MAC address is identified as a telephone number and is required to be retained and to be disclosed. But the policy says if they don't have it available, if they don't have the visibility, they're not required to, which is probably the right way to do it. The issue with this is that it is not the place for policy to make an exception to the law. It would be preferred for it to be made under legislation, for example. The added issue to that is that the metadata, for example, the MAC address, is then in turn being sourced directly from the likes of Apple, because most of the telecommunications operators have no visibility of that. The big question then is, if Apple is not regulated as an over-the-top content provider, what are some of those guidelines that may be in place for that relationship and that assistance that guys like Apple provide to local agencies? Whereas for local providers, there is the metadata retention regime and a string of hurdles that they need to go through, although we may question the competency of that, but there are some rules in place. What the rules may be in place for instances where those MAC addresses may be directly sourced from the likes of Apple. And the MAC addresses, as I indicated, under the red zone would be used as information that's used to source interception warrants, for example. The irony is that these policy exceptions, although perhaps contrary to the written law, have a privacy protective element to it. It effectively minimizes the metadata retained and disclosed, whether it's intended or not. However, the law must clarify such an exception as per the rule of law principle. Now, the green zone refers to the 5 tuple. This is the retained data zone. Okay? So the amber zone and the blue zone is information. It's not required to be retained, but you may. And if you need it for your business purposes, you may. For the data retention scheme, it's optional to retain. The green zone is the information that is required and that must be retained. It is the information that's required to be retained. It is the retained data. It is all the metadata that remains after the policy and the legal exceptions have been deducted. It is also deemed to be personal information. However, it is only deemed to be personal information and only if it is related to an individual or to the communications that that individual was a party to. It is the metadata that is proposed to be extended to civil cases. It is only the information that's required to be retained for the purposes of the data retention regime that the proposal seeks to cover under civil cases. So, having looked at the distinction between the blue zone and the amber zone, if that is not information that is required to be retained, can that information, in other words, your destination information when you access the internet, can that then be used in civil cases, for example, copyright infringements, because it is not technically retained data. It is only data that may be voluntarily be retained. Can an ISP claim that that's a distinction and then say, I can't give you the whole session metadata, I can give you only what is required, which is the source data. But just hold on to that. We'll get to the gray zone just now and see how that may impact that. Under the gray zone, that is also the 5-tuple zone. However, under the proposed TSSR, it is any information. The AGD is granted, or the Secretary in the Attorney General's office is granted the power, the information gathering power, to collect any information from the telecommunications company. It is just the same metadata through and through. But a different regime has been proposed under the TSSR as contrary to the one that's currently existing under the metadata retention scheme. The only difference being that under the TSSR, it may include all the other information that may be voluntarily retained. And that's why the gray zone is on the outer ring, because it may include all of these. So it is potentially all the metadata from all the zones combined, and possibly more. The telco is required to do its best to protect the critical telecommunications infrastructure. Okay? The telco must exercise competent supervision. And as evidence of that, the telco must disclose to the Attorney General's Department and the ASIO, and the ASIO may share that with the AFP, any of this information, and they may share it on with third parties. The telco may not challenge it, may not refuse that request. So in doing your best, and in exercising competent supervision, the ISP may capture and analyze the 5-tuple. In other words, the over-the-top content. Or not. Would they be required, for example, to do deep packet inspection, to capture those packets, analyze it? Would that be a reasonable interpretation of what doing your best and competent supervision means? The explanatory memorandum seems to think so. It may require the retention, therefore, of session metadata, and may require for longer periods. This is the advent of using metadata for cybersecurity purposes. Considered to be more effective than commercially off-the-shelf tools that are less flexible and not as scalable, it requires adopting a situational awareness or a threat awareness or a cyber threat intelligence strategy. And what this strategy allows you to do as the ISP is that you get a full picture view of all the data in your network. These strategies specifically put the user of that service and the user of that device at the core and at the focus. Why? to get the user behavior context. That's intelligence. You want to know what your employees are doing, for example. You want to know what the authorization processes are, what the business processes are. You want to know who's got access to what database, to what information. And that gives you the overall context that if you analyze the metadata, that you would know that there is no way that you expect packets coming from the finance department to a certain database that is not meant to come from there, and that will give you an idea whether that may be an incident, whether that may be an attack, for example. That's your situational awareness. And it's not about known threats anymore. It is about emerging threats. Under this strategy, you assume that you're going to be attacked. But you want to detect the threat as quickly as possible, and you want to remedy it within the shortest period of time. Because traditional and off-the-shelf tools just don't work as effectively anymore. The sole purpose, however, of the gray zone, we're told, is to use it for national security purposes. Or is it? In all the other zones, it's already included, it's already national security and law enforcement, but the gray zone is designated for national security. There are two major general rules regarding this regime. Okay. So all of these things that I've said are underpinned by two major rules. And the first one is all information related to the contents or substance of the communication is legally required to be disclosed to the agencies, but under various processes if the agencies request it. The telco must give reasonably necessary assistance. Practically, the agencies may not exercise that right, but they hold the power to do so. So all the information in the outer ring is required. There's a general duty on the ISP to disclose it to the agencies. All that the retention regime did is to retain that information for a certain period of time so that there's guaranteed access to that. But that does not mean that that's all the metadata that's out there. Okay? And the exceptions to that. So legally, the ISPs are still required to disclose all of that if they have it in their possession. Secondly, the telco will have some of that metadata available at some stage and continues to hold it for longer if it makes financial sense, if it makes business sense, and if it makes cybersecurity sense. If they adopt a cyber threat intelligence strategy, it will make sense for them to retain it. Right now, it's not a big thing. I don't think many of the ISPs retain it. I think many of them think it's useless network data. They don't need to keep what they don't need to keep. But the trend is developing that metadata is being used for cyber security. Why? Attribution. If the AGD has reason to believe that telco has the relevant information in its possession, it must disclose it. There is, however, no reasonably necessary assistance standard under the TSSR, as opposed to under this regime where the information must be granted because you're giving reasonably necessary assistance. It will give the telco a better context if they retain all of that information, all that session metadata. However, the agencies can access that information simply through a self-certification process. Because the authorization and notification process that's being used under the retention regime is not applicable in the gray zone. The circumstances under which it's accessed, which the session metadata is accessed and used is therefore important. The rules regarding access are, however, becoming blurred. It creates vulnerabilities in the law. And in cybersecurity, we know that vulnerabilities are only good for one thing: exploitation. So therefore, governance is key. And that brings me to my conclusion. Overall, the metadata under all the zones are just the same metadata at the end of the day. The same metadata is accessed for the same purpose: law enforcement, national security. However, the oversight mechanisms regarding access for security under the regime and under the TSSR differ vastly. Grey zone metadata, which is the vast majority of the data, require no authorization and no notification process, and no independent oversight, unlike the rest of the zones. The Commonwealth Ombudsman is not granted oversight powers, for example, over the AFP, over the grey zone metadata that the ASIO may share with it, unlike within the green zone. So back to the unprecedented wall. So let's build that wall, and that wall will do the following 11 things, and then I'll conclude. Firstly, it will clarify the legal and policy ambiguities regarding the types of metadata and the oversight. It will introduce rules for sharing metadata between the AGD's office, the ASIO and the AFP, and the third parties. Rules regarding overlap and scope between law enforcement functions and national security investigations, for example. So can they use the metadata that they've sourced for national security if they determine that this is evidence for a law enforcement investigation that may be conducted? How are those rules set up? They may exist, but it's not out in the public. Fourthly, we must prevent bypassing of the metadata retention regime, because there's a big opportunity to rather go with the forum that's less bureaucratic than having to go through an authorization and notification process. Because basically, what the TSSR does, in the respect of national security at least, is that it duplicates it. It creates two separate regimes for the same thing. The one creates more metadata to be harvested, the other one allows for less metadata to be harvested and allows for more rules. We should introduce an authorization and notification regime under the TSSR that will prevent forum shopping or address it. And we must specify oversight by the Commonwealth Ombudsman and the Office of the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security under the TSSR. And we must address over-the-top content service providers and what their responsibilities are in terms of over-the-top services, web apps being used in cyber attacks, because they constitute the biggest proportion of services used for attacks. We should align the TSSR and the retention scheme so that it's not fragmented, because that fragmentation just leads to exploitation of this framework. Destination addresses are not retained data in terms of the law. So we must clarify whether that may be used in civil cases or not, because if you access the internet by using an internet access service, that metadata is not required to be retained. Can the ISP be allowed then to disclose it in a civil case, such as the Village Roadshow case, or would they be saying, oh no, I'm not allowed to? Or is it already open for use under civil cases because it's not retained data? It's voluntarily retained. And lastly, we should classify URLs as content and indicate that that requires a judicial warrant to access. Thank you very much.